G'day, it's Paul Rowe. Welcome to my office. You know, the last few years I've decided that I would walk into the life of Jesus, get inside his skin, try and understand him. Somebody said to me once, if you want to be Christ-like, you need to study what Christ is like, which makes sense, doesn't it? And so I decided I'd choose the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, his account of Jesus' life to talk you through. Now, I don't know how long it'll take. It might take us a year to go through this. But these are my journal notes. I'm not saying it's a polished sermon. It's not trying to be erudite or intellectual or something, but just my thoughts as I sit and think and read the text that Luke wrote in probably around 65 to 70 AD, so about 30 years after Jesus. And I hope that you get excited like I did when I first sort of took a step into the Gospel of Luke, and it changed my life. I'm a historian by training, so I went to university. That's what I was trained as. And one of the things they taught me there was a historian's got to get inside the skin of the people. That's your number one job, and try to use your imagination as well as your reason to sort of paint the picture, understand the people, and try to deliver as reliable a picture as you can. That's the first reason. The second reason is because it has to do with a personal spiritual renewal. When I was at university, I was under the hammer from a university professor, and a friend, Laurie McIntosh, stepped in alongside me, and he helped me see that I was standing on good ground, that the documents I was reading, like Luke, were reliable and reasonable and well researched, and I could be confident about my faith. And so that was a big step forward for me as a Christian, as a young Christian. And I can still remember Laurie reading from J.B. Phillips' New Testament, and I can still hear him reading the little preface to Luke that we're going to start on today. Luke chapter 1, where he says, "Many people have written an account of the events that have happened amongst us, basing their work on the evidence of those who, we know, were eyewitnesses as well as teachers of the message. I have therefore decided, since I've traced the course of these happenings carefully from the beginning, to set them down for myself in their proper order, so that you may have reliable information about the matters in which you already had instruction." Well, I can remember that as clear as day, Laurie reading that out, and it gripped my heart because I was a young historian, I was at university, I was being challenged, and to somehow hear the gospel that I heard all my life as growing up in church, but suddenly I realised, wow, these documents can stand rigorous tests. You know, these are historical documents. These things really happened. So that was a big change for me, and I suppose it was almost like a beginning of a mission for me too, because Laurie didn't just preach at us like that, but he took us out to actually run this message past university students on campus and test ourselves that way. I laughed a bit when I was looking this up, because I found the bookmark I had here was my call-up card in 1969 when the Vietnam War was on. And this was my call-up card, and I thought, well, that's appropriate, because I put it in there, because this was sort of like my call-up, hearing Luke read like that, and it was my call-up to use my gifts as a historian, and I had no idea where it was going to lead, but it was a very significant moment in my life. And I think the last thing is more in the present day. There's an urgency. I picked up a book that's only just been printed by Greg Sheridan. It's called Christians, the Urgent Case for Jesus in Our World. He's a journalist from Melbourne with the Australian newspaper, and he's saying, you know, we really need to bring the story of Jesus into the marketplace and tell it to people, because they just don't know it. And they've been sold a lot of misinformation about Jesus. And he's getting a lot of traction. And when I started reading it, I realised this is pretty much the stuff Laurie was teaching us back 50 years ago when I was on university campus. It's sort of been rewritten, if you like, and given a new thrust. So that's why I want to take you into Luke, and I hope you enjoy the journey. I've had a lot of fun doing it, and these are my thoughts. So without further ado, let's launch into the Gospel of Luke. I hope you're going to read the chapter for yourself. I won't try to read all the text to you, but I'm going to try and work through verses 1 to 11. So if you haven't read it already, maybe you need to pause and do that. The sense I get when I hear Luke's voice here is that he's confident, he's assertive. You know, many have undertaken this job, gone out looking for the information. I've decided I'm going to go out and do my own research, which is good. That's being a good historian. Apparently there were already a lot of other accounts around at the time, so he wasn't the first. And they too were basing their evidence on eyewitnesses. He was interviewing people. Now, I've been an oral historian. I've gone out in the town of Burke, and I've done more than 100 interviews with old timers, probably more. And I know that from doing oral histories that I could reconstruct pretty much what happened in Burke, say 50 years previously, from talking to all the old timers. I could put together a pretty reliable picture of what happened there. So I've been there and I've done this. So I did identify with Luke, and he sets a template for himself. He said, I want to get eyewitness evidence. I've carefully investigated it so you can have a reliable account, he's saying to his friend Theophilus. So obviously the bloke he's writing to wants to know accurate information. Now, Luke's no armchair historian. He's out there, he's interviewing people. And remember, he's already out there on mission with Paul. He is travelling the Roman world, and he's seeing Christians suffering for their faith, for believing this story, the story of Jesus. So this is not like this is a bit of a side chair, sort of side interest. This is life and death. Like, he knows that the people that he's giving this story to are putting their lives on the line for it. He's watched Paul do it over and over and over and over again. So this is serious business. This is no sort of, idle bit of literature he's writing, but this is crucial stuff to get this story accurate, get it right, because he sees this is not just another story. This is the story. If it's true that Jesus is the Son of God and he's come to this planet from outside, if the Creator has come here, well, you can't get much bigger story than that. So you can imagine him travelling with Paul, who was a rabbi and a scholar, and you can imagine them sort of debating this stuff, telling the stories, checking, so that both of them would have been very intelligent men doing their homework. And they were both putting their lives on the line for this, and the lives of their team, and the people that they were preaching to, all across the Roman world. So he needs to know that this is true, and truthfulness was literally a matter of life and death for these men. He calls the people he's talking to calls them servants of the word. That's a nice phrase, isn't it? That they'd given themselves to be good, diligent servants, to be carrying this message humbly and confidently to the world, servants of the word. A serious commitment. They weren't just scholars, but they were men out there on the coal face doing it, and they weren't sort of philosophers in Athens or rabbis in the temple sort of discussing points of law. The life of Jesus had galvanized these men to action, and it was dangerous service that they were involved with, and they were convinced that this was the most extraordinary story in all of human history, and it commanded the highest and most intelligent response. And their lives were testimony to that story. Paul said to his converts at Ephesus, live life then with a due sense of responsibility, not as those who don't know the meaning and purpose of life, but as those who do. Well, those are the words, the kind of words I heard Laurie reading out of this J.B. Phillips New Testament that echoed in my life and got me mobilised, I suppose you would say, as a Christian. And particularly because I was studying history, it was very close to my heart. So he sets about gathering this data, and he knew that there are other accounts around. One of the things I discovered later in life when I was researching, and I've got the books down there on my library, but they said that Luke wasn't just a good historian. There were questions about him from some scholars maybe 50 years ago, or earlier, sorry, but there were questions about the accuracy of Luke. Well, I know at least one very famous historian, archaeologist, a guy called William Ramsay, set out to actually disprove Luke's veracity, whether he was accurate or not. So he went out as an archaeologist across Turkey, checking the stories that Luke had recounted in the book of Acts, and into Israel as well. And the amazing thing that came about as he did more and more digging, if you like, he found that Luke wasn't just average good, he was brilliant. He was incredibly accurate. And so when we're handling this document, we're not talking about a guy who was sort of sloppy in his work. He was a doctor. He was a trained man, and he was getting very accurate, eyewitness evidence and probably cross-checking the facts like any good historian should do. So he wanted to establish the sequence of events so that the flow would come naturally, and truthfulness was at the core of what he was doing. He wanted the reader to be sure about this astonishing story of Jesus. And he was talking to a world that was, the Roman world, the Greco-Roman world was full of gods. So they had no shortage of gods. They had gods for everything, and they had pantheons of gods. And to be talking about another god was, well, yeah, there's another one comes along. But he was trying to get it very clear to the Theophilus and the wider world as well, that this was just not another god, not just another story. This was the story. And particularly in the context of Israel and the documents that Israel had about its history, this was a fulfillment of an amazing long story that had been unfolding for a long time, and now it had come to a crisis. This was 0 hour. The key person had arrived, and he'd lived his life among them, and they'd witnessed it. And so he's talking to these people who saw Jesus do all these things and gathering the information so they can have a really accurate picture of what he's like. So, not just another God, but the defining person. This is the defining story. Eventually, all other stories, or all other claims to be God, have to be measured against this story. And that's what Luke, I think, was aware of. We've got to get this really clear while we can, while the eyewitnesses are alive. And I think as you go through the Gospels of Luke, as we travel through, you'll see that there's an amazing groundedness about the story. There's sort of the details that only an eyewitness could give you. And as you read, it's got that flavour. This rings true. This rings authentic. The hand fits the glove. You know, it actually is in places with people and events and bits of government and all that sort of stuff that actually fit the picture. The archaeology has confirmed that, you know, Luke's not just making up a fairy tale here. He's actually reporting a true story. Well, I don't know about you, but that gives me great courage. It gives me confidence in my faith, that I'm not just telling another story. But as Greg Sheridan says in his book here, there's an urgent case for Jesus in our world. We need to put it urgently. And so as we travel together, and I'll pause it here after this verse and we'll carry on a little bit further. But I want you to sort of get that sense that we're handling something in this book that's not just an idle fiction or just a few scattered memories, but it's a very carefully gathered, researched, structured and crafted piece of work that Luke's given us. And he's given us a brilliant story. I mean, these are amazing stories. There's nothing like them in the world. And I can say as a historian, it's convinced me, it's changed my life. And I hope that as you travel through the book, you'll get to love Jesus more and sort of see more of him, get inside his skin, get inside the skin of the people that were around him, and get a grip of the story so you can tell this story naturally to others. Join me again.